Here we are, the aftermath of the Coercive Acts in 1774. This was passed by the English Parliament, the English government, in reaction to the Boston Tea Party of December 1773. You should be familiar with the parts of the Coercive Acts because it caused such an outrage in the colonies that they decided that they were going to meet. They were going to send representatives from each of the colonies to one place, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and that meeting would take place in the fall of 1774. This is known as the First Continental Congress. 12 of the 13 colonies sent representatives to this meeting, and they did some important things there. First, we have to consider who attends. We've got folks who are very radical. Samuel Adams, again, going back to his history with the Stamp Act protest. Sam Adams wants to break ties completely with Great Britain. Other people say, no, we're not there yet. We've got to wait. So you've got very radical individuals in some of the colonies. You've got some who are more moderate and say, let us address the issue and maybe the English will change their ways. Or you've got others who are saying, no, we can't do anything strongly against England because if you're talking about, militarizing to that degree, what will happen is you're considering taking on the greatest military power, a superpower in the world in 1774. So we've got three groups here, more radical, more kind of middle of the road, who want to have a moderate position, and those who are a little bit more conservatives who were saying, look, you all have to weigh the risks if you're thinking about using the I word, independence, breaking free from Great Britain, and then fighting Great Britain, because that's what it's going to take to actually win independence. So in this meeting, they decide to make a couple of important decisions. Number one, they decide to stand with Massachusetts. They're going to support Boston, they're going to support the colony of Massachusetts, and they are going to resist the Coercive Acts. So they vote to send food, to supplies, to Boston. Because the Coercive Acts, or as the colonists called them, the Intolerable Acts, were directed at Boston, directed at Massachusetts for the tea. Now when you have 12 of 13 colonies, meeting in one place, speaking with one voice, that's not good news for England. Again, the colonists have been really bad at combining their efforts, putting aside jealousies and differences, and getting in one place and speaking with one voice. And that's what they do at the First Continental Congress. They say also that they're going to put together continental associations that will, number one, enforce a boycott of British goods. We're going to stop importing British and European goods that come into the American colonies. They had threatened it with the Stamp Act, and they had made it reality over the Townshend duties in 1768 and 1769. This was going to be a colony-wide banning of purchasing British goods. They were also, after 1775, as it says there in the notes, they were going to, at the same time, stop exporting American products. Well, we don't make a lot of things in the colonies, but they're talking about stopping rice, tobacco, other raw materials that the English and the English colonists around the world had used, no more. So that's upping the ante a little bit, to say it differently. Banning imports, stopping boycott of British goods is one thing, but stopping exporting American products is another. So they're putting together these groups, continental associations they're called, that will enforce boycotts. That's neighbor watching neighbor, everybody. Reporting you if you are consuming British goods to the newspaper, and you're going to see your name in that newspaper. Public shaming for violating the boycott. This is now your patriotic duty to resist Great Britain. We're now in the fall of 1774. Committees of safety will go around and make sure that these boycotts of both imports and exports are enforced. The Continental Congress at this meeting also suggests that they begin to up the training of the military forces in the colonies, the militia. Able-bodied men 16 to 60 years of age who can serve in this temporary, again, peacetime armed force, to increase the training, to begin to locate and set aside military stores. That means gunpowder. That means muskets, flints. You need a flint to cause the spark to make the gun to go off. All of those supplies Maybe we should take them away from the peering eyes of the British officials in each colony. And then they decide to do something that is very significant, so much so that I put it in the notes in boldface. Before they leave, they say, we're going to meet again. We adjourn this meeting of the Continental Congress. We will re-adjourn in May 1775. What they did not know, and we know now, is that in between the First and Second Continental Congress, the shooting will start between His Majesty's soldiers and militia of New England and Massachusetts. Of course, they didn't know that, but they left hoping that reconciliation or healing the relationship between the colonies and England can happen. They want it to happen desperately. Ben Franklin, unfortunately, has had enough. He's brought before members of the King's advisors and humiliated because he leaked letters, private letters. Ironic because he serves as Postmaster General. Now, you're not supposed to tamper with people's mail, and that's what Benjamin Franklin did. He did it so he could prove to people back in the colonies, look, there is just a small group of people in England and in the colonies who mean to deny you your rights, colonists. Instead, that wasn't the issue. They brought him in front of the King's advisors and they humiliated him. They called him a knave, a rogue, a scoundrel. Bad words in the 18th century. To which Franklin said, you know what? I think the relationship between the colonies and Great Britain, and he is a proud Briton, meaning a proud Englishman, and can't do it anymore. 70 years old, it forces Franklin to be a rebel. And he decides also he should probably leave England because he would serve his fellow colonists and Pennsylvania, the colony, better if he were to return to the American colonies. So in the aftermath of what we call the First Continental Congress, historians have used the term an insurgency to describe the way I would phrase it. The breakdown of English authority in the colonies. It very much accelerates after 1774, late 1774, early 1775. We call it the insurgency. It's a strange word possibly, but it was used back then. I mean, the royal officials, the people who want to keep law and order in the colonies, called it an insurgency. The governors of the different colonies would say, I'm fighting an insurgency. This is no longer a resistance to British tax policy. This is something more than that. It's a coordinated effort. And the First Continental Congress wanted to make sure that this effort did stay coordinated. As the First Continental Congress adjourned and these representatives, these delegates went back to their respective colonies. In Massachusetts, in violation of the Coercive Acts, town meetings take place all throughout the colony. Town meetings were only supposed to happen with the permission of the governor. Okay, try and stop. He dared the governor of Massachusetts, General Gage. So the man who's in charge of the soldiers, he's also in charge of the civilian authority in Massachusetts. He didn't have enough soldiers to enforce the law. Governors begin to write back to their bosses in London. Do something. Help us. Or forget this. Finish this. Finish this or forget it. That's the message the people in London who make policy are getting from those who are in the colonies, feeling increasingly desperate. Assemblies in the different colonies. The Virginia Burgesses. This is the institution that goes back to 1619, and Jamestown is banned from meeting by the royal governor. Every time you all meet, all you do is talk about how to defy British law. So they meet in private homes and taverns. The American Rebellion was planned in bars around the American colonies. I know because I had to read the books about it in graduate school. But it's true. If you cannot meet in the Capitol, if the governors padlock the doors to these buildings, this is where you meet. And you talk about enforcing non-importation. You participate and have meetings of the Continental associations, the committees of safety, which go out and make sure that all the neighbors are actually good, patriotic citizens and continuing to boycott British goods, continuing not to export your products. It's going to be economically difficult, but it's to put pressure on England to change their policies. Committees of safety then decide if we're going to stockpile ammunition, stockpile arms. We're going to train one part of our militia to react very quickly. They begin to train what are called Minutemen, ready at a minute's notice. This whole line or idea of sleeping with a gun next to you, I mean, it's not that much of an exaggeration. These were elements of the militia in the different colonies that were supposed to be ready very, very quickly and rapidly in case there was any threat, which they expected, especially those who are in Massachusetts, because that's where the soldiers are. A good portion of the British soldiers in North America are in the Boston area. Royal governors begin to talk about, and the phrase that they use is shadow governments. We no longer run the colony. The official government of the colony has no authority. This is the insurgency, folks. This is what it means, the breakdown of British authority in North America. It's happening in Massachusetts, it's happening in South Carolina, it's happening in New Jersey, New York, and it's accelerated after the First Continental Congress, that meeting that took place in September of 1774. Patrick Henry throws up his hands in the House of Burgesses, makes his famous "Give me liberty" as he thumps his chest, "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Talking about, of course, is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains or slavery. It's ironic because Henry and other Virginians are slave owners. But the slavery metaphor means we will be treated as slaves, second-class citizens in the British Empire. Someone said that in Parliament. This is the quote he said. "Why are the loudest yelps of liberty from the drivers of Negroes?" They asked the question. The word they would have used in the 18th century. It's a good question to ask. But the slavery idea, and they were conscious of it, Washington even says it, we will be treated just as the slaves that we have taken their liberty from them and their life. That's what's going to happen to us. And they knew that this was a slightly hypocritical situation. But you see it repeated in the words of these folks in 1774 and 1775. The governor and general, two roles. This is the two hats that Thomas Gage wears in Massachusetts. He's been appointed the royal governor. He's in charge of the soldiers in North America. He has a unique position, unlike other governors up and down the eastern coast. He has 4,000 soldiers at his command. Governor of Virginia doesn't. Governor of York, New Jersey, others don't. He has 4,000 soldiers, some of the best trained soldiers at his command. And he is given basically a blank check by his bosses in London. If you see an opportunity to arrest the ringleaders of this resistance, Samuel Adams and John Hancock the smuggler. One guy's a great propagandist and bad at economic choices, Adams. John Hancock is great at smuggling and maybe the richest guy in New England, if not all of the American colonies. Arrest public enemy number 1 and 2, shut down the town meetings that we know are happening, close up the insurgency in Boston and in the countryside. This is not simply a rebellion in Boston. They're linking city and town. That's what Gage is worried about. His soldiers have to go out in force to get any, what we would today call intelligence. Because every time they go out, they're confronted by groups of militia and other people. Sometimes the soldiers don't wear their uniforms so that they can try to get information from the townsfolk and not identify themselves as soldiers, but no one's fooled. I mean, they go up to restaurants and try to eat, and they get pitchers of water and stuff dumped on them, and everyone knows who they are. But this is what he's dealing with late 1774, early 1775. So he gets, as I said, a blank check, carte blanche, to go out and essentially, if you can, shut down the town meetings, find the different areas where the colonists had stored ammunition and military weapons. and then arrest some of the ringleaders of the resistance in the colony, that would be great. And he puts it together in the spring of 1775. He handpicks from his army about 700 soldiers who are going to go out in equivalent of a strike force. These are the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, Grenadiers. They are the tallest gentlemen in the army, and they wear the furry caps to make them look taller and more intimidating. Royal Marines, light infantry. He goes and chooses this group. They are going to float from ships in Boston to the mainland, leave Boston, and march towards where they know, because just as the colonial resistance has information about what's happening when the British soldiers are on the move or anything is taking place, we also know that Gage has a strong spy network as well. Let's keep in mind and remind all of you that not everyone who is a colonist is within this resistance group. There are loyal Americans, loyalists, also nicknamed Tories, that say England do or die to the very end. And they're feeding Gage and the other officers in the British Army information. I know that I've seen people literally wheeling these hogshead barrels of gunpowder in Concord, Massachusetts. And Gage says, okay, let's go out and get it. I've got soldiers from one of the best armies in the world. The resistance had also put together a way by which they could actually use a network to let everyone know when there was going to be any attempt by the British to march. Get this out of the way here. Oh, make sure we're sharing this because I want everyone to see this. Okay. One of those who was involved in it, and he's involved in several of the actual resistance movements, is the silversmith we talked about last time, Paul Revere. Revere is one of several express riders throughout the American colonies, who, when the British organized and marched from Boston to Concord, they were going to get word to everybody in the towns in between Boston and Concord. Concord's about, I think, 15 miles west of Boston. Boston right there on the coast. So Revere went out and he didn't tell everybody when the soldiers were assembling. Again, at night, under cover of darkness, they hoped. He didn't say the British are coming because everyone knew that the British were already there. In fact, most people in Massachusetts thought they were British. What he did say on horseback, yelling, not the British are coming, the British are coming, because if he said that, people would say, we're all British, go back to bed, you moron. It's 4 a.m. Instead, he would say the regulars are out. That meant something else. Okay. Boston, Massachusetts had been on high alert for several months. They expect the soldiers to march. Not a question of if they would, but when. And when they did, Revere and others went out, fanned out, and what did they do? They woke up the countryside and they had the militia, the Minutemen, get ready. One of the first places that the British Army had to pass through outside of Boston was this little crossroads called Lexington. And there assembled were a handful of the militia. You can see them here in the slide. Sorry, I'm going off microphone a little bit. It's a little more clear to all of you watching and all of you in the classroom. A representation of Lexington Green. Again, just a few houses. Many of those who were in the militia were probably having their first drink of the day in Buckman's Tavern, which is right there in Lexington Green. And the British basically fanned out. There are many more of them than the colonists, the Minutemen who are there. And it's one of those moments in time when the second hand on the clock starts slowing down really, really slowly. Someone, probably the gentleman on horseback in the background, would have yelled something along, "Throw down your weapons, you damn rebels!" To which the commander of the Minutemen said, "Guys, you know what? There's a lot more of them than us. And we should probably go. And if we all go, I'll buy the next round at Buckman's Tavern." But none of the Minutemen left. They just stood there. And they didn't put down their guns either. And so the British officer, again, we're at a standstill, a staring contest. And this is one of those incidents in world history when a shot is fired somewhere. Who knows? A nervous British soldier, a nervous Minuteman. It could have been somebody who was emptying their loaded weapon before going into a building, which you were supposed to do back in the 1700s. And that made somebody jumpy, and the British fired into the Minutemen at Lexington. Some of the Minutemen fired back. Some of them, as you can see here, are dead on the ground. And that basically concludes the Battle of Lexington. The militia clear out, the Minutemen, the soldiers continue, and they make their way towards Concord, where they didn't find a lot of military stores. I mean, they knew, as the story goes, that the British were on the move. Some of that they got rid of. They couldn't arrest Samuel Adams or John Hancock. They were long gone. The British found in Concord more resistance, not just 30 or 50 Minutemen assembled there at Lexington, but hundreds of militia from the surrounding towns. And when the British decided, okay, we've been in Concord long enough, we've got to make our way back to Boston, they had to fight their way out of it. They had a full-scale engagement with elements of the New England militia at Concord. That's why we lumped together the battles of Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775. Then the British make their way back to Boston and have to fight a running battle for miles. This is a lot of these paintings and portraits. Obviously, the artists have taken license, and sometimes they're accurate and sometimes they're not. They went to a lot of work to make this accurate. It looks as though in the background you see the British, they are trying to march back on the road to get to Boston because they're realizing we are outnumbered, outgunned, and even though the colonists aren't really good soldiers, some of them have, there's no uniforms, they're all mismatched here. They're taking pot shots at us the whole way back. So on the left side, you see elements of the Grenadiers trying to chase down some of these colonists who are shooting at them. And the whole retreat is a battle until the British had been out and on their feet all day long, just collapse within the safety of Boston. The battles of Lexington and Concord, April 19th, 1775. Okay, let's go back to the notes, because this is something we very much have to point out, and it is very important to understand. And that is, we think automatically, okay, after Lexington and Concord, there is an almost inevitable movement to break from Great Britain. But let me remind you of something on the timeline. It's April 1775. The vote on independence is July 1776. 15 months pass between Lexington and Concord and the July vote. 15 months. This does not mean, because blood has been shed, both of British soldiers and American colonists and militia, that they're going to just sever ties completely and immediately after this. Not at all. So as I said last time, when the First Continental Congress left, they said, we're going to meet again. They didn't realize that there would be these battles, because when they do meet again in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress, once again in Philadelphia, decide, all right, we now have outside Boston a group of thousands of militia surrounding the city. What do we do? What do we call this group? We should put someone in charge of it. Massachusetts has veterans of the French and Indian War that are there. But what is the role of this force? I mean, the British don't want to call it an army. They call it a rabble in arms. Nevertheless, there are, after Lexington and Concord, people around New England who are armed descend on the city. What next? Well, the first thing to do is to adopt this army and call it the Continental Army and recruit from all the different colonies and choose a commander. What you want to emphasize to the people in Massachusetts, outside Massachusetts, and in England, that this is a continental force. It's not just the New England Rebellion. This is what the English always think about the beginning of this, and they make a mistake thinking about it this way. It is a Continental rebellion. And so it makes sense to not have a New Englander in charge of a New England army. So they decide to choose someone who's a member of the Second Continental Congress. John Adams nominates the 43-year-old veteran of the French and Indian War from Virginia, George Washington, to be commander of the Continental Army. Makes sense. He's young. He's radicalized. He believes in the cause. He supports by now, we're talking about the spring of 1775, Washington supports independence, even if many members of the Congress don't. He's got military experience, some good, we know, some bad. He kind of had some growing pains to get through during the French and Indian War. Why not have a Virginian command a New England army? Great move by Adams. Washington also showed up at the Continental Congress in full new uniform. It's kind of like, I'm George Washington, ready for action, kind of an advertisement. But he was trying to show, at least he would tell you if you asked him personally, well, I want to show that Virginia stands with Massachusetts. Well, I also think, honestly, he probably thought he was a candidate for the job. But we don't know what that job is. You're head of the Continental Army. What is the Army's cause in 1775? Don't know, because there is no unified message from the Continental Congress. Some people believe at this meeting, and Congress will continue to meet. They don't meet for a while and adjourn. They meet and they contemplate the relationship with Great Britain. And a lot of people say what we need to do, hopefully, is by this show of this bloodshed and adopting this army, England will pull back, repeal the coercive acts, tell us how they made the mistake, and we can repair the relationship. Others say, no, it's too far broken. And then others are saying, wait a minute, you want to take on not average Britain, Great Britain. The best navy in the world, one of the best armies in the world. We have an army, in quotes. We have no continental navy. There is none. It doesn't exist. And you want to take on Great Britain to secure independence? No, that's not a very popular opinion. So the Second Continental Congress, in the meantime, is reconsidering the relationship with Great Britain, begins to print money. They begin to put themselves on more like a group who's going to run a continued possible conflict with Great Britain. And then they begin to look around the world for getting help, military help, and more importantly, financial help. Traditional enemies from Great Britain. I'm trying to think of one here. France comes to mind almost immediately, the one they had just beaten in the last conflict. Before Washington can even get to Boston, however, soldiers who are there in this new army fight the British at the Battle of Bunker Hill, which for most folks in England really changes things, is a game changer, you might say. At the Battle of Bunker Hill, what takes place? The British take 1,000 casualties. Battle of Bunker Hill, the British had noticed that, oh my gosh, if the colonists, this army, it's not an army, if they are able to ever get like cannons or things on these high ground above the city, bad things are going to happen. So they try to move the militia, and they suffer 1,000 casualties. That's 25% of their fighting force. This is an actual drawn-out battle. Washington isn't there to see it because he's still in Philadelphia on his way to Massachusetts. So a couple of myths emerge after the Battle of Bunker Hill that are significant for us to understand, that we have to place in the context of what is happening here. Number one, the Americans think we're good soldiers. Look at what we had just done. Now, it didn't matter that all the militia retreated, but they punched the British army in the face. Militia also, they think, can win the war. See, unlike the corrupt, old and decadent systems of Europe, we in the colonies don't need a standing army. The virtuous volunteer soldier in the militia will win the war for us. And Americans make great soldiers against the English. Two of the Bunker Hill myths. These myths continue throughout the war. Washington works really hard to undo a lot of these myths, like only militia, these volunteer short-term soldiers, can fight the British. He thinks, no, we need an actual full-time, professionally trained army. After Bunker Hill, now the news when this reaches folks back in England, especially the King, George III, he is outraged at the Battle of Bunker Hill. These colonists, my loyal colonists, have inflicted 1,000 casualties on the King's army. And he declares the colonies in open rebellion. What does that mean? It's not just the phrase I throw out there. It means he can treat them as a hostile entity. And he does. It means he can use the Navy, the Royal Navy, the best in the world, to shut down the colonies, which he begins to do at the end of 1775. The Congress also, after Bunker Hill, sends the King an olive branch petition. It's literally the olive branch, right? The American eagle, you've seen it on the currency, the quiver of arrows in one of its talons, and the olive branch in the other. Peace. And they appeal directly to the King. The King doesn't want to hear anything about an olive branch. He basically completely dismisses it. It's a way for the members of Congress to say, see, we're still giving peace a chance. Or trying to invoke the King to step in and stop things from getting any worse. But what do you do when you're in Congress? Even after Bunker Hill, there are members in Congress who say, no, we cannot break ties permanently with Great Britain. And John Adams says, we'll just wait it out. I favor independence, he says, but I know people in Pennsylvania, Carolina, New York, they don't. We'll wait. Things will happen to push people. There are enough folks who are kind of sitting on the fence. You've got radicals like my cousin Sam. You've got more conservatives who say, never, ever, never can we sever ties with Great Britain. And you've got folks who are kind of, maybe a couple events will push them in one direction to support independence. Not sure. Little by little, things happen, though. It makes it more and more difficult for members of Congress to think we can actually reconcile with Great Britain. In 1775, at the end of the year, the royal governor decides that he will order a proclamation. It's called the Dunmore Proclamation, Royal Governor Dunmore, that any slaves in the colony of Virginia make their way to British authorities will get their freedom. The colonist translation, oh my God, the governor is inviting a race war. Now, very quickly, the people in England say, nope, 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 Dunmore does not speak for us. We do not back this proposition or idea, but it brings up the prospect that they could emancipate slaves, the British, if they wanted to. Because obviously, from the British authorities' point of view, this is a blanket invitation, not only for the slaves who are owned by the rebels, but the slaves owned by loyal British people. So how can you give this proclamation and make it go into effect? So they quickly step away with it and tell Dunmore, you're way out of line with this. But it builds a narrative, right? For people in the South, look at the depths that the English will resort to. The promise to free our slaves. That's a frightening thought for a lot of folks, especially in the southern colonies. In the beginning of 1776, there's news from overseas that the English had decided to hire Hessian soldiers. These are from the German states. The Hessians, this is standard operating procedure, folks. The English hire mercenary soldiers from other countries to help them fight in Europe. They did it during the French and Indian War. The King's family is from Germany. His grandfather, George II, had actually spoke German as his first language, and then he learned English. You know, the English king should learn English. But George III hired mercenaries, and the Hessians, you may have heard stories of the American Revolution, the Hessian mercenaries who come over from the German states. The image of the Hessians in North America is they rape women and kill babies for fun. And when you are on your knee begging for mercy, they will take that bayonet, they will stab it in your chest, and they'll twist. They don't offer quarter. That means mercy. Are these true? Nope. Did it matter? Nope. Perception and reality. The Hessians. Our king has hired mercenaries to put down the rebellion in the colonies. Shocking. So see how we're building a case here. This is Adams, John Adams, saying it's like a convoy of ships sailing across the ocean. There'll be some stragglers, but we're going to eventually all get to our destination. We'll all get to that place on our own speed, but we're going to get there. Meanwhile, the military affairs are taking a life of their own. Elements of the Continental Army captured the British Fort Ticonderoga in New York. What does that mean? All of a sudden, the Continental Army has cannons. The fort, state-of-the-art fort, built by the French, then rebuilt by the English, have cannons ringing this star-shaped fort. They capture them, and they begin to move them from upstate New York to Washington's encampment in Boston. Loyalists in North Carolina fight colonial militia in the eastern part of the colony in 1776. So this is happening, even while Congress is still thinking about what do we do next. And then in 1776, in January, a new pamphlet appears that begins to sway more and more Americans. We see the early publication of what's known as Thomas Paine's Common Sense. Common Sense pamphlet is 46 pages long, but it is and provides Americans who are trying to understand the legal and constitutional relationship with Great Britain in common terms. That's why it gets the name Common Sense. Thomas Paine had been a tax collector in England, failed at it because he didn't like shaking people down for tax money. He had also made corsets for women. A couple of failed careers, and he comes over to the American colonies because he seems to be a good and skilled writer. Common sense says independence is the only path we should take at this point. Plain language. An Englishman is now talking to the colonists saying, this is where you go next. And in a way that everyday people can understand. This isn't an argument of a lawyer or of a skilled college professor. It's just someone speaking, making reference to a history of England, kings, divine right. The King of France thinks he's God appointment on earth. Are you kidding me? No, no. Monarchy only elevates fools, he says. Common sense. The Americans need to be independent. Monarchy is a joke. Independence is rational. And in one of his famous phrases, an island should never rule a continent. Island of England should never rule a continent. So he quotes from a book that most people who can read have, Bible, along with probably a farmer's almanac of some kind. And so there are a lot of allusions to that book, Old Testament and New Testament, making the argument. Again, it is sold well, it is reprinted, you read it, you hear about it, and just like today, it would be shared on what? Social media of different kinds, FaceSpace and Fritter, whatever those things are called, and then you would all, from there, talk and discuss about that. Well, back then it was in taverns and churches and homes and meeting houses, and it builds this case that independence is the path that the colonies should take. By the spring of 1776, the colonies, which have been in open rebellion since the end of 1775, several colonies have basically said, we're going to cut ties with Great Britain. Now, this is one of those questions of the dog wagging the tail or the tail wagging the dog. Because in our 2020 mindset, 2020 mindset, not 2020 vision, but that too, we typically think from a top-down perspective. We think Congress is going to drive the colonies to become independent. But in this case, the roles are reversed. The colonies are, and North Carolina votes for basically independence on its own in the spring of 1776. And they're very proud about that to this day. So they say the relationship between us and England is done for before Congress votes. So this is the message that is holding up Congress from doing something more substantial. They have to wait to get instructions from their respective colony. More and more of the representatives in Philadelphia are saying, the folks back home are saying, do it already. Break the ties. Sever the connection with Great Britain. And with that in mind, in June, Richard Henry Lee of the colony of Virginia introduces a resolution by which the colonies are henceforth and forever independent of Great Britain. It's a vote. Well, you want this vote to be, again, overwhelming in support. You want to make sure it doesn't embarrass anybody who supports the vote by being divided. 7 colonies for, 4 against. And so you wait. It's June. You hold off on the actual vote to be done in Congress. And you also want to draft some kind of statement by which you can explain the reasons and the necessity for independence. So they form a committee of gentlemen who are already elected to the Continental Congress. Some are well known, a couple of them are not well known at all. The committee is made up of the following individuals. This painting, again, not exactly all that accurate, because John Adams looks really old in this painting here, like he would have been as president. Anyway, there's 5 of them. Unfortunately, most people can name like 3, and the other 2 are like, yeah, that other guy and that other guy. The 3 most prominent are there in this slide. On the left is Benjamin Franklin. Middle is John Adams of Massachusetts. The unknown, because he's so quiet and so painfully shy he doesn't speak in public, is Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. They go around the room and say, who should write this thing? And John Adams will later say, well, I didn't write it because I didn't think it would be all that important. That's John Adams saying, damn it, I wish I had written it. But Franklin, by his age, they think out of respect, you write it. He said, nah, I don't think you want a 70-something-year-old guy, the poster child for independence. So they go to Adams. And you're well known. You're not your hot-blooded cousin Samuel. You're more of a moderate. He says, no. Problem with me writing it, John Adams says, is that everyone thinks in Massachusetts and New England and all the colonies and in England that this is a New England rebellion. So you don't want a New England man doing it. That leaves Jefferson. And people had known Jefferson to be maybe not a thump your chest, give me liberty or give me death guy like his fellow Virginian Patrick Henry, but he was a good writer. He sat in the back, didn't say much, but he had written something very similar related to his own colony of Virginia, the Virginia Declaration of Grievances, which he heavily borrowed from in this first draft. That he, again, rented a house in Philadelphia. And we think in about 2 days, he had the first draft going. And he gave it back to the committee. And the committee looked at it and said, we're going to make some changes. Turn of phrases that were very clever, Franklin put those in. Things that Jefferson wanted in, the committee took out. And then the whole Congress took out. Jefferson had, in his original draft of the Declaration of Independence, a ringing denunciation of the slave trade. And he laid it at the feet of George III. The South Carolina and Georgia folks read that and said, can I have that red pen, please? Yeah, thank you. Whoop, going right out. Nope. Because that opens up a whole other possibilities about what this declaration might say and be about. But we know it's there because Jefferson kept the original draft. The one, and he's a slave owner, a substantial slave owner. He will die broke and unable to do what some of his contemporaries had done, free their slaves, because he keeps making bad financial choices after bad financial choices. But they take that part out. A ringing denunciation of the slave trade is taken out of the original draft of the Declaration, and we're left with the final draft, which again is the work of Jefferson, it's the work of the committee, and it's the work of the entire Congress. There are 2 parts to the Declaration of Independence that you should be familiar with. Just because it's the birth certificate of the United States and because you might get tested on these things. And I want you to know the difference between the Declaration and the Constitution. There is no form of government in the Declaration. If you're unsure about what it does, repeat the title to yourself. The Declaration of Independence declares independence. There's no talk of branches of government. There's no Bill of Rights listed. No. It simply declares that the colonies will be independent. And there are 2 parts. There's the natural rights section. You're familiar with that part. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The natural rights section. It's John Locke's idea that governments are entered in by the people, so we don't go around killing each other like it's the, what's that film, the Purge? Everyone, all laws are off and everyone. That's why we do that, so we don't live in some kind of crazy state of nature. So we surrender some of our rights and give them to the government because we want them to protect these things that we value. You used to say property, life, liberty, and property, but they took that out because not everyone owns property. And pursuit of happiness. Did it apply to everybody? No. But they left it open to maybe one day it would. They're not perfect, these folks. They're slave owners. They're sexist. They're ageist. They don't think kids under a certain age should say anything, let alone vote. But they're people of their time, and we have to keep that in mind when we're very critical of them. We should be critical of them, but at the same time, they were doing something very different. Okay, they were talking about the idea that we don't need a king. We can govern ourselves. And we said creator, not the Judeo-Christian God, not Jewish God, not followers of Islam God, just their creator, wherever you identify with certain inalienable rights. So they're given to you by your birth as a human. Okay, and when governments fail to protect these rights, you have to institute a new one. The other part, the longer part of the Declaration, deals with the grievances against the king. The king? Why the king? Because in 1776, in June and July, when Jefferson's writing this document, you'll see parts of it if you ever read it. It says he has, again, had trials without juries. He's taxed us without our consent. He's stationed Army soldiers in our private homes. Just think of everything that's happened over the last couple of lectures. He has. Is it fair to blame the king? No. But by June 1776, Jefferson and the Congress don't think there is any authority left to Parliament. Parliament is not legitimate. The king's advisors are not legitimate. And George III is. What are they telling George III? You could have stopped this and you didn't. This is not an easy decision. This is breaking up of a family. This is a secession from the British Empire. And at the end of it, of course, they pledge their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. We criticize the founding fathers, and we should. They're not perfect, but this was a treason document that they were all signing. They voted on it on July 2nd. That should be Independence Day. I'm not sure why the 4th of July is Independence Day, but they vote by colony. New Jersey would stand up and say New Jersey votes yes. Massachusetts votes yes. And so they go through that. New York hesitated because they knew that the British, who had recently evacuated Boston, were on their way somewhere else. The British gave up Boston in 1776. Washington's first military victory. Hooray. But at the same time, members of Congress thought, they're not conceding defeat. They're going to redeploy somewhere else. Where would you go if you were the British Army with the British Navy, now backed by the mercenaries of the Hessians? New York, everyone knows. It's the next destination of the British Army for the campaign in 1776. And so the New York members of the Congress say, we can't vote, we abstain. So the vote technically is 12 for independence, 0 against, with New York abstaining. July 2nd, 1776. You want to get a jump on your Independence Day parties with your friends, have it when it should be, on the 2nd. That's the vote. The 4th is probably when they adopted the Declaration, having made all the changes and pushing it through the entire Congress. Again, I'll leave you today with why Washington's name is absent. People go to the archives and they see this and they read it and they say, wow, I don't see his name. Why didn't he sign it? Because he's, of course, trying to figure out where to put his army to defend New York City. A city he does not want to defend. Why? Because it's a bunch of damn islands. And the British have a navy, and there is no Continental Navy. Where in the world do I put the army? The British can maneuver wherever they want with their navy, and it's going to be very difficult to defend New York.